I love learning. I always have been really fascinated by the world and all the things that are around us and wanting to find out as much as I can about it all of the time. And to me, learning is a little bit like going on an adventure because you never quite know where it's going to take you. You might start off by thinking, oh, I'm going to find out everything I can about, I don't know, how they make chocolate. And then through that, you discover something about geography and something about history and something about cookery and science and all these other aspects all sort of merge together into this one sort of ball of learning. And that's what I find really exciting, is all these different connections and these different pathways that you might not think that you're looking for, but that kind of come along unexpectedly. And I've always been really, really interested in history and the world around us and how the things that have gone on in the past shape the way that we deal with the world now. And I find that really fascinating. And as a child, one of my most favourite places in the whole world was our local museum. And I was forever dragging my parents down to this museum and looking at I must have seen it 1,000 times, the same exhibits and the same artifacts, but I always found them really interesting because they made me feel so connected with this great sort of sense of history and these things that had gone on before and how they were still here in my local area and still were really relevant to me today. And I could feel these connections stretching out across places and times. And for me, that's the really exciting thing about learning, is because you're always really at the very centre of it. And it's like this big sort of cobweb of connections radiate out across and will take you to all different and unexpected places. I think that concern is so universal. It's like the parents that I talk to, the students that I've taught in the past, all parents seem to have these concerns that my child will only read this one very specific type of book, maybe sometimes just this one author, and they'll read the same books over and over and over, and they won't read anything else, and it's just awful, and I need to get them to be reading, classics, and we must be reading Shakespeare and Dickens, and we must be reading these worthy books that are amazing and will educate. And I think it seems such a common worry, but it really isn't something that you need to worry about, because children will naturally progress on at their own rate. And there is something very comforting in rereading and having something familiar there. And when you're learning to read, and when you're learning how these different things work together and these different shapes of stories come together, it can be really nice to have that familiarity that you kind of know it's all going to work out in the end. So my advice to parents is always don't worry too much about it. Children will naturally want to kind of radiate out and find other things. And don't try and push it too hard too soon, because there's always that one poor child who gets forced into reading sort of classic literature far too early and then hates reading forever. And you do not want that to be your child. So yes, you may look at it and go, my child reads nothing but comics. My child reads nothing but these kind of really silly adventure stories, but that's okay, because you have to start there before you can progress onto other things. And I had a really brilliant quote that I read, which is something along the lines of, read what you love until you love to read. And I think that's really important. You have to love what you're reading to begin with before you can have this really sturdy basis to go out and to try other things. And I think if you really do want to try and sort of expand your child's reading, one thing you can try doing is homing in on what is it exactly that your child is really enjoying about this particular set of books. Is it the illustrations? Is it the comedy style? Is it the fact that they're all based on fairy tales? And maybe take that as a starting point and go, okay, you really like this particular element. Let's find another book that's got this element in it. So maybe it's got the same illustrator. Or they really like this one version of Cinderella. We're going to read lots of other different versions of Cinderella, and we can compare them and see what they like. And maybe sort of little baby steps out. But don't worry too much that they're not reading all the books that maybe you hope that they will read, because they will eventually. Well, my route to becoming a teacher was a little bit unusual, I guess. So I started off, used to work in the theatre. And one of the things that I did was I was a script writer as well as a performer and a lighting technician and everything all at once. But of course, it's quite difficult to make a living working in the theatre. So I kind of migrated into teaching sort of through that way. So I ended up as an English and drama teacher for a while. So I never really had it in my head that I was going to write a book as such. I'd always written scripts, and I'd always been really fascinated by storytelling, and in particular the kind of architecture of the story. So what is beginning? What do you have to have in the beginning? What has to happen in the middle? And what has to happen in the end? And how do we kind of get from point to point to point? And how do you know if the story is working or not? And I always find those elements really, really fascinating. So no, I never thought that I was going to sit down and write a book. I'd always read and I'd always loved books, but it never kind of been in my mind as to something that I was going to do. But part of my brain has always been, as I say, really fascinated by these stories. So it was always sort of there. And the way that I came to write my first book, How to Be a Hero, and all the other ones since, is I literally woke up one day and had an idea for a story, but this one wasn't a script like what I'd written before. This was a novel, and this was something completely different for me, and I almost had to go kind of back to scratch of how do I write this. So I'd been used to writing scripts, which are very fun to write, but they're kind of stripped back, so you've just got the dialogue and you might have some description, but you don't have any of this kind of descriptive writing about scene setting or anything. You might just have, so and so walks out of the house, it is a sunny day. That might be your stage direction. And now all of a sudden I had to deal with, well, how do I describe this sunny day? And how does this work? And then how do I embed the dialogue into it so it will make sense as a sort of satisfying thing to read? So it was kind of interesting that I had to sort of restructure everything that I'd kind of known. But I never sort of had the ambition that I was going to write, and I've been been trying to write a book for 10 years or anything like that. But it was literally a story came to me and I went, oh, I better write this down. And then it all kind of spiraled from there. And thankfully, other people enjoyed my story as well. And I've been able to share it with loads of people ever since. I kind of knew from the beginning that the book that I had started wasn't going to be able to contain everything that I wanted to fit into it. Because I found the more that I started researching and reading and discovering more about sort of Norse mythology and this point in history and all this, the more I wanted to include and the more places I wanted to send my characters and the more things I wanted them to experience. And I couldn't fit that into the sort of word count that I had for that first book. So I really had to hope that other people would want to find out more about it as well, and that I'd be able to write more books within the series. I think Vikings almost have like an image problem. There is such a very strong pop culture idea of what a Viking is. And that is generally a large, hairy man with the helmet, with the horns, possibly holding some sort of bladed weapon, charging off a boat to kill everyone in sight, drinking mead and ale and eating big lumps of meat. That is our kind of vision of what a Viking is. But the more you kind of look into the Viking world, the stranger and more bizarre and colourful and bright and amazing it becomes. Because I think a lot of people, and certainly at me as a child, when you start looking at things in the past, you almost see it in black and white. Everything's covered in mud and they're all, dying of the plague, and it's all very grim and miserable and probably standing in a wet field somewhere with a sheep. And it's all kind of very dull. But their world was not like that at all. So I'd always been fascinated in world mythology. I find it really, really intriguing why these stories have survived for like thousands of years when we've lost so many other things in that time. What is it about these characters and these locations and these stories that we're still reciting to each other and we still tell to each other today and they still survive? There has to be something in them that really speaks to us still as human beings, and they tell us something about who we are and where we've come from. So I was always really interested in mythology and Norse mythology within part of that, because where I live, we were raided by Vikings. There's a lot of Viking sort of history here, Viking archaeology and things. So that was always kind of growing up. It was something kind of lurking always in the back of my mind. And so, as I said, the more that I started looking into this world, so I had some ideas of what these people were like, big, hairy, horned cats, But then the more you start looking into it, the more the world kind of opens up around you. And it's so hilarious. The worldview that they had is so different and remarkable so different to that kind of Viking invader image to what we have. It's so just intriguing, and the more I find out, the more I want to find out. And I would, encourage anyone just to have a look a little bit at some of the things that they thought and the ideas that they had. And by the way, the horned helmet thing is a total lie. They never wore horned helmets. That's always a massive disappointment to everybody, but there has never been any archaeological evidence that they wore these things. And if you think about it, if you're like shoulder to shoulder in battle or in a longboat with other people and you've got big spikes sticking out of your head, it's not going to end well for anybody, is it? I mean, they're all just going to get knocked off at the best, and someone's going to lose an eye at the worst. So that's an amazing image, but unfortunately it's just not true. And I think a lot of the ideas that we have about the Viking world kind of fall under that umbrella. They were into so many other things than what we kind of give them credit for. So one of the first sort of things that you kind of get taught as a child in the UK when you're learning about Vikings is that they really, really loved poetry. And that's kind of not a thing that you associate with these Viking invaders, but they absolutely love poetry. It was one of their top entertainments, was to sort of sit around in the evenings around the open fire and tell each other riddles and have sort of guessing games and things like that. And some of the riddles and the poems still exist, and you can sort of read extracts of them. And another thing that the Vikings really enjoyed doing, which still kind of we have echoes of it today, was this thing called flighting, which you will never have heard of, but it's brilliant because it's basically a rap battle. So you'd have two competitors and you would have to invent boasts about yourself or insults about the other person, and they'd take it in turns until one person won. And that was their great best entertainment of what they would do. So the rap battle or the roast battle, that comes from the Vikings. That is echoed down to us from the last 1,000 years. We can trace the history back. And it's just sort of amazing. You sort of imagine these people sitting around and all, insulting each other, going, "Oh, Olaf, you are so smelly. I can kill more peasants than you can," and all this. It brings them to life in a completely different way. There are a lot of names, and you do kind of need the framework, the structure, to sort of know what goes where. And it is very, very easy just to end up with like a list of dates and a list of kings and queens and major battles, and that's kind of it, and it's a bit boring. But there are all these other amazing stories that are woven into this. And I think sometimes it just takes that spark of inspiration, or that one person who knows that one weird fact, who can just kind of bring a whole sort of life into bright colour all of a sudden. And then you're given this kind of little snapshot of what these people actually thought and how they lived their lives. And it wasn't all just, dates and times and places and these kind of dry things. And I certainly hope that within education, that people are trying to move more into that kind of humanising the people of the past. And I think there also used to be very much this kind of superior way of looking back at the past as we are the peak. We are the greatest people who have ever lived, and everyone who is in the past is somehow less than we are, and they're not as clever, or they weren't as capable as we are, and they weren't able to do as much as we can now, and we can kind of judge them, and we can look at their lives and kind of make these calls on what they did and the things that they believed. And I'm really hoping that people are starting to move away from this idea and kind of trying to broaden their view and go, yes, okay, maybe people did think different things in the past, but just because it's different doesn't mean that it's bad. And I think that sometimes just having that little crack of light into a way of thinking or a different time period or even a different place can be really helpful in kind of finding the human links between everything. So the first character that I came up with was Whetstone, who is the boy in the books. He is a Viking, but he is not a typical Viking. And I think that was kind of my starting point. I didn't want to write about a successful, well-rounded individual who would do all the Viking things that we would expect Vikings to do. I wanted to explore what it would be like if you were in Viking society, but you didn't kind of conform to the expectations that people might have of you. So what if you weren't very good at fighting and got horribly seasick every time you went on a boat, and you were a little bit kind of shifty and sneaky? Because none of those things would be what you would want your Viking hero to be. And so that was my idea. It was like, well, who could be the worst person that I could put in this story, and then what would happen? So I kind of had him in my mind, and then I came up with Lotta, who is the girl, and she is a Valkyrie. And I wanted a Valkyrie because I wanted my characters to be able to travel between these amazing different worlds that exist in Norse mythology. So she had her job quite early on, because that's a nice way of getting them around. And I thought, well, if she's going to pick up Whetstone by accident and take him off to the world of the gods instead of a hero or a warrior, which is what Valkyries are supposed to do, I need to make him like the worst person that she could collect. And then I needed her to be a big contrast to Whetstone. So you've got Whetstone, he's a little bit sneaky, he's a bit of a misfit, he's quite clever, but he's not very good at fighting or traveling or doing any of these other sort of key skills that you need to be a Viking. So Lotta needed to have a lot of the skills that he didn't have. So she is quite bold and brave, and she doesn't always think things through and can make some very bad decisions just on kind of gut instinct. And then between the two of them, there was this sort of lovely, bubbling kind of resentment, conflict, friendship kind of comes out of it in the end, because I think they both very much recognised that they had strengths and weaknesses that kind of went together, and together they could do a lot more than either of them could do individually. But certainly to start off with, they are both incredibly resentful of the situation that they find themselves in. And it's like, how can you try and stop me from doing the thing that I want to do? And you're getting in my way. And why on earth are you doing that? You're making it worse. And then from that, we kind of have this evolution where they sort of figure things out together. And I thought that was brilliant. And one of my favourite parts of the books to write was all these kind of bickering sequences where they just spend their entire time fighting each other. And they have these kind of rivalries in between. They've got their conflicting goals of what they want to do. And they're both quite vocal about what they're going to do and how it's gone wrong and how it's all the other person's fault. And they were lots of fun to try and write and imagine. And then trying to find these moments where they sort of come together, and you can sort of see the friendship starting to form between them. And they actually, maybe you're not so bad after all. And maybe you do know what you're talking about. Maybe you do have some good ideas, but I'm not going to tell you that. So we're just going to have to see what happens here. And then the force is kind of pushing them together until they do eventually become friends. But I really had sort of very strong ideas of who they were going to be fairly early on, because I really wanted to explore this kind of bickering friendship that kind of develops. It is one of those things that looks easy, but actually is quite hard, particularly if you're not naturally a sort of a person who enjoys having a lot of attention on you. And so the only tips really that I can have is that if you know you're going to be presenting something, or you have to do a talk or anything like that, is first of all, be really prepared. So know what it is that you're going to say, rehearse it, practice, write down notes if you need to. Talk it through with somebody else so that you feel confident and comfortable with what that you're going to do and what you're going to say. And then the next part is then to not let your nerves get in the way of it. You've got to find a way of making yourself calm. And again, that could be quite tricky, and everyone will have their own way of doing that. Maybe you need to take some deep breaths, maybe you need to listen to some music, maybe you just need to hold somebody's hand, or have something, a lucky charm in your pocket that you can kind of focus on that will kind of take the attention away a little bit. And the last sort of tip I suppose I have for doing anything like this is to try and find something in it that you enjoy. So whether you're talking about something that you enjoy, or you're sharing a story about something that's really special to you, or you're talking to people who you really like, try and find a little element within what you're talking about that you can really kind of have fun with. Because at the end of the day, if you are having fun talking and sharing your story or your presentation, the people who are watching you and listening to you will enjoy it so much more than if you're stood there kind of rigid with fear, waiting for it to be over, because everybody then feels your nervousness and they're not enjoying what you're saying either. So you've got to try and relax and try and find something that's a little bit fun, whether you're going to try and sneak a joke in, or you're going to put in a little silly picture, or just something for you, just to keep yourself happy and enjoying what you're doing as well. Because if you're hating it, everybody else is kind of hating it as well. But if you're loving what you're talking about, or what you're presenting, or what you're sharing, then everybody else will enjoy it as well. There is one experience that I can pretty much guarantee that every British person will have had, which involves fish and chips at the seaside, but it's raining, so you have to eat them while sitting in your car and looking out of the window at this kind of grey, drizzly beach. So, and it's weirdly fun. I'll say that in its defense, okay? It's kind of character building, but every British person will have had the experience of going, we'll go to the beach and get some fish and chips, and then got there and have realised that it's a terrible day for to be doing this. You can't sit outside because the seagulls will steal your chips. It's probably drizzling, so everybody's kind of wet and wearing many layers of clothing, and you all end up sitting back in the car and eating in the car while looking out at the beautiful landscape that you've come to see, but it's kind of all covered in fog and sea mist. And so I think that sums up a trip to the British seaside, and something nice to eat as well, because it makes you feel all nice and warm, and the windows are getting all steamy because it's cold outside, and you're all lovely and warm outside inside with your family. And so it sounds a bit weird, but I think that is probably an experience that everybody needs to have at some point in their lives.